Hey everybody, in today's video I'm going to go over VLOOKUP, and specifically I'm going to go over some of the things that can go wrong with the VLOOKUP formula. And so I'll explain why there's situations where you may get an incorrect result, or why your formula is not getting the right value, or the one that you'd be expecting to. So here I've got a list of cars, makes, models, and I'm going to use a VLOOKUP formula to enter a value here and produce a result here. So for example, if I type in Integra, I'm going to do a VLOOKUP here, and a VLOOKUP formula is fairly simple. I select the value that I'm looking up, my table array, so I could just select this entire thing, the column that I want to extract from. So if I'm looking up Integra, I want to return the make. Column 2, set it to false because I want an exact match. So simple enough. It works fairly well. You know, I can do a copy and paste and use another lookup, and it works just fine. However, here's how it can go wrong. So in this example, the value I'm looking at is in row 9. But let's say I'm looking up, something further down here, like the Tahoe. So that's in cell, or in row 124. And if I just have a range where I have got a fixed range of, let's say, 1 to 100, I'm going to get an NA error here because this range doesn't go far enough down, because it only goes up to row 100. And the value that I need is in 124. So because it's outside the scope of this range, I'm going to get an NA error. And this can happen, when you're manually selecting the range. Like in the early example, I just selected the entire column, and that's probably a best case to use, unless you're doing multiple lookups or you don't want it to overlap with other data. Then generally using entire columns is going to be a safer approach, because the danger is you could forget to lock these cells, and so let's say you copy this down, and now you'll notice this range changes. So that's a common issue as well, if you forget to freeze these lookups. So I put in F4 and freeze these, then they stay intact. But if you forget to lock them, and let's say you're doing multiple VLOOKUP formulas, then that's where you could run into an issue. Another issue is, you've got, let's say, 100 cars listed on here, and you continue adding to that list, but you don't update your range. That's another example of how your range may no longer be correct. Another way your range might be wrong is, let's say we've got the entire column selected, but this time we've got B and C. Again, this is wrong here because in a VLOOKUP function, what it's doing is it's looking at this value in the leftmost column. And that's one of the limitations of VLOOKUP, is that it's always going to look in this first column. So it's going to look in column B. But because this is the model, it's in column A. So it's not going to find it unless it happens to also be in this column. So that's another thing to watch out for, is to make sure that the column that your VLOOKUP should be looking at is the first one in this range. So if I start from A, then I'm fine. But if it's starting from B, it's going to be looking at the make instead of the model. And that's the problem here. So the range is an easy one to fix, and probably a really common one, especially once you start copying and pasting, and if you've forgotten to freeze these values. Because sometimes people may be tempted to just select the entire range that they need, but then that range can expand over time, or you copy the formulas and you've forgotten to freeze them. So that issue number 1 is just not having that correct range. Another common issue is, let's say I've got A to B here, but you enter the wrong column number. So let's say I enter column 1, right? I'm going to get the same result. That's not what I want. If I enter column number 3, now I'm getting a reference error because this is outside of the scope of my lookup. I've only got 2 columns. I'm saying to pull from column 3, but column 3 isn't within this range. So now that's another example. Even if you've got a range of A to C, you've got the wrong column listed here, you'd still get an unintended result. The most common reason I see this happening is because people have large data sets. Let's say you've got 20 columns, and over time, you insert another column, whatever the case may be, and you'll notice as you do so, this number doesn't update. So with Excel formulas, typically if you're referencing a cell or a column and you insert a column, it'll automatically update. But this number is hard-coded, so Excel isn't going to know to increment this if you add a column. If I delete a column, it's not going to update. It's going to stay at the 3. So that's the most common issue I see with that, is when you're hard-coding these column numbers, they're going to change over time. And this is where, it's a bit of a limitation, especially if you've got a huge data set. I wouldn't suggest doing this. This is where you may want to do something like an index and match, where I'll show you as an example. So if we did the index function, we're going to select exactly where we want to extract from. So I'm going to select this entire column. Now we're using a range, and using the match function for the row, I'm going to select this value and look up this column, 0. And the column number is just going to be 1 because I've only selected one column here. I close that up, and now it's giving me that value. And now even if I insert multiple columns, it doesn't matter, because now that range is updating because it's a range and not a number. So that's the advantage of using index and match. And again, this is, I would say this is primarily going to be useful if you've got a large data set, or if you expect it to expand. Because the challenging part, as you can imagine, is you look at this VLOOKUP and you look at column 3 or column 2, whatever the case may be. If you've got dozens or hundreds of columns, it's going to be hard to know what this relates to, what this number relates to. You're going to have to go back and count columns, which is not going to be really useful. So that's an issue where, you could potentially be pulling values from the wrong column. So if you've got a really complex or large data set, then probably index or match would be a bit easier, as opposed to the VLOOKUP. You could also use the XLOOKUP, which is available on newer versions of Excel. But if you're using an older one, then index or match would probably be a better option. So that's issue number 2, is extracting values from the wrong column. A third issue that you could run into is if you're hard coding values. For instance, instead of referencing this cell, we're going to type it in manually. So let's say Tahoe, and adjust this to column 2. Works fine. But let's say we make a mistake. Now our lookup's wrong, because now this value does not exist in here. So a simple mistake can be problematic, because you're looking for a match, and if it doesn't exist, you're going to get an error. And so this is why generally you want to be referencing a cell as opposed to just hard coding it in here. The advantage of doing so is that you can see what your lookup value is versus having to look in the formula. Now you could also have a problem if these values are misspelled, because you may spell it correctly here, but there may be a mistake on here. So issue number 3 is just misspelling your lookup or having mistakes in your data set. Another other issue that's similar but not really misspelling is if you've got an extra space in your lookup. So even if I just add a simple space after this, that's not going to work, because now I'm looking for an exact match, and even an extra space can throw it off. Similarly on here, if you've got data that hasn't been cleaned up and you've got extra spaces, that can be a problem. And it's particularly problematic with the space after, because just that looking at this, you wouldn't be able to spot that there's an extra space in here. If there was a space at the beginning, maybe a little bit more noticeable, because you see that gap. But with a trailing space, it's not as easy to do that. One way you can check for this is using the right function. So I just select this value, I get the rightmost cell, and it's a blank. So I know that's a problem. So if I remove this, now I can see that it ends in an E, which is correct. And so this is something you could apply to your data set as well to check, okay, are there any blanks? You could use a right function, right, onto here and see if there are any blanks on here. So that's another way that your values may not be correct, is you've got an extra space either in your lookup value or in your data set. Another tricky issue you could run into is when you're dealing with numbers. So let's say I add an ID for each one of these values. So I just type in the row number, copy this down. So increment it. I'm gonna just copy this over as values. And let's say I want to do a lookup this time of the first item. So I'm gonna do a VLOOKUP, and this time I need to include column A because that's where I'm looking that up. And I will want to return the mod. And so this works fine, but the problem could be is if your number isn't reading as a number and instead it's text. So I'll give you an example. So if I were to add an apostrophe in front here, that's not going to be reading as a number. And this can sometimes happen if you're copying data from somewhere else and it's not formatted properly. Like here, Excel tells me this number is formatted as a text or preceded by an apostrophe. Now, it doesn't always have an apostrophe, but it still could be reading as text. And a quick way you'll notice is that text by default aligns to the left, whereas numbers align to the right. One way you could change this is just clicking this and say convert to number. Another thing you could do, take the number 1, copy, paste special, and you can do multiply. Multiplies everything by 1 and converts it back into a number. But that's one example of when dealing with numbers can be a little tricky, because if it's stored as text and you may not notice that it is, and you're wondering why your lookup's not working, check the data type. Another thing you could do is use the isText function to say, okay, is this a text value? This one is true. Now, if I were to do the same formula on this, it's going to tell me it's false. This one is not text, but this one is text. So that's a quick formula you could use to determine if it's a text value or not. Another issue that you could run into is when you're using approximate matches. So up until now, I've been using this last argument set to a false, which I'm using in an exact match. And in most cases, I find that's probably what you're going to be using it for. If you set it to true, the danger is, let's say I type in Tahoe again here. And so I'm going to start with column B. Right now I've got an entirely different result than what I'm looking for. And the danger is this can vary depending on how your data is sorted. And, if it's not in ascending order, it's not in, where it might make sense for it to be, then you can end up with a result that's entirely wrong. So if you do need an exact match, you're better off setting this to false. The one area where you may want an approximate match is if you're dealing with numbers and, let's say, ranges. So a good example might be tax brackets. If someone makes $50,000 and you need to find out what tax bracket they fall into, you're not going to be looking for an exact match in that case. You're going to be looking at which bucket they fall into. In that case, you're looking for an approximate match. But in most cases for VLOOKUP, you're going to be looking for an exact match. So you want to be careful of that, because if you take that for granted and set that to true, then you could end up with something unexpected. What I found that if you leave this argument blank and don't enter at all, sometimes it could be unexpected. Like in this case, it gives me the wrong result. But in the past, if it's in in the right order, then it'll give you the correct one. So it's important that you make sure that you set this to false, so that if you need an exact match, it is pulling an exact match. Now the last issue that I'm going to cover is probably the most frustrating one, especially if you've done your VLOOKUP formula properly, but you're still running into issues. So let's say I'm good with my tables here, and let's say I want my models on a separate sheet. Just want to keep it clean, want to have my lookup table on a separate sheet, and here I want to pull in the model, pull in my results. So here I'll do a VLOOKUP, and I want to be pulling in from this table and selecting this value. So if I select that, look up this, comma 2, comma false, we're all good. Okay, so ILX looks right. Copy this down. All right, everything looks okay here. Let's just space these out. So everything looks as it should, but let's say I want to sort the model, right? I'm going to go in ascending order. Now you'll see that, row 3, I'm referencing row 442. So this is completely out of whack, right? So these ranges, as you'll notice, they are not consistent at all. So this is one of the most common issues that I found with people, especially when they're doing tables like this and they're doing lookups. That stuff gets sorted completely out of order, right? So you're no longer referencing this. So the issue is we've got this reference here. It says sheet 2. If I were to get rid of this and just type in A2, copy this down. Now this is correct. Now when I go to resort this, let's say I do the opposite, descending order. It's still fine, right? So this still works. So you may be wondering, okay, why is there that sheet? Why is that sheet reference showing up in there? And so the key thing that you'll want to look for when you're doing this is when you're working with multiple sheets. So you may not have noticed when I first created this VLOOKUP function, but if I were to create this VLOOKUP as it is, and say this value goes into here, comma 2, comma false, all right? Whoops. So right now, I don't have that sheet reference. So now if I sort it, everything is still fine, right? The issue comes when you're bouncing in between the different sheets. So for example, let's do this again. Let's do a VLOOKUP again. But before selecting my VLOOKUP value, I switch over to this sheet. Now Excel's populating the sheet number. If I go back to sheet 2, now you've got that sheet 2. And the first time I did this formula, you'll notice I first jumped over to sheet 1. And by doing so, Excel's now populating that sheet reference. And so now when I select A2, it's got that attached to it. And the danger of this is now Excel's not going to recalculate that value. In other words, it's not going to update it when I do the sort. So the way to fix that is when you're doing the VLOOKUP, if I just cleanly click on this before going to the other sheet, then I'm fine. So this is a common issue that happens if you've got multiple sheets and you're jumping from one to another. Because, if you don't do that, then you're fine. If I do VLOOKUP here, just one more time, this one is fine. There's no sheet reference. But if I go to VLOOKUP here, and before clicking on this, I jump over here to say, okay, what am I referencing? What do I want to do? Right? I go back in here. You won't even notice, or you may not notice, that, now it's added that sheet reference. Click here. And even though my formula is basically the same, the logic is correct, it's sound, the problem is this one's got that reference just because before selecting that cell, I jumped over to that other sheet and then came back in here. So Excel's starting to track which sheet I'm on. So if you don't do that, you avoid that issue. So if if your lookup table's on the same sheet as where you're doing the VLOOKUP, then you're fine. It only could potentially be an issue if it's on a different sheet and you don't notice this as you're doing this. But definitely one thing you'll want to watch out for if you have multiple sheets and you're doing a VLOOKUP, just because this is a common issue that can happen. It's definitely a frustrating one where you're sorting data and you know that your VLOOKUP formula is right. So a really subtle thing to watch out for if you're dealing with multiple sheets. So that's 7 ways that your VLOOKUP function could get you the wrong results. So I hope that that helps you, because I think VLOOKUP's still a powerful function, even though there's XLOOKUP and all that other stuff. VLOOKUP works on older versions of Excel, and it's still really versatile and useful. And by avoiding this pitfalls, you can still get a lot of value from it. So hope you found this useful, and thank you for watching.